time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. We're back on the political scene talking to a friend of the PBG. It's Nicholas Powers out in New York State. We're going to be talking about the impeachment hearings, a little bit about the debates and politics in general. And I just love Nicholas Powers. This guy is very informed. He's got a real progressive point of view. And, you know, most of what you get here on the show, obviously, is of me, but it's from the heartland. Well, Nick's out there in New York State, and he's got the progressive point of view from there. I want to introduce him to folks that may not be familiar with him so you can get his bona fides here. I'll read this. Nicholas Powers is a poet. He's an associate professor of literature at the State University of New York, Old Westbury, with writings in Truth Out, the Huffington Post, Alternate, and the Independent. And that's where I follow him, is in the Independent. Upset Press published his book of journalism, The Ground Below Zero, 9/11 to Burning Man, New Orleans to Darfur, Haiti to Occupy Wall Street, and that was published back in 2014. And that's the introduction for Nicholas. I really like this guy because not only is he smart and informed, but he's a lot of guys talk it, myself included, but this guy walks it. I mean, he's a boots on the ground kind of guy. You'll see him out there walking the line once in a while, carrying a sign. I've done that, and I always appreciate and respect somebody of a like mind. So, Nick, I got to tell you, I'm watching these impeachment hearings, and I'm getting a little creeped out. I'm a little worried. To tell you what I'm talking about here, now my wife, she watches every minute of this. She's really informed. I mean, she is down in the weeds, and she knows that Trump's got a problem here. He's got a real issue. He knows that he should be impeached in the House, but my God, Nick, I hope Nancy Pelosi knows what she's doing. I hope she had the votes going into this thing, because I'm kind of a check it out once in a while kind of a guy, and I'm looking at this, and this is not exactly spellbinding material. I mean, you've got to be understanding of these matters to be in the impeachment category. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, my God, I don't know. And what chills me to the bone about this goes back to the biggest news event of your lifetime, probably, and maybe even of mine, as old as I am, and it's that Iraq War that I reference all the time. As you'll recall, there was an intelligence report, very lengthy, very in-depth, that deserved attention. Everybody should have read that because they were voting in the Senate to give George W. Bush the power to go to war with Iraq, and it came to be known later that many of those senators only read the summary. I mean, they damn near just read the cover sheet, Nick. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, if they're just walking by and checking this out once in a while like I am, I don't know. I hope we know what we're doing, headed down this rabbit hole. But I feel good about it because you wrote an article in The Independent and it was impeaching Trump is defending democracy. You're all for it. You're all in.
I'm definitely all in. Impeachment was a needed action if we were going to protect our democracy. And I heard that. I heard there's so many debates going back and forth, like a verbal tug of war. Should they go to impeach? Should they not go to impeach? And of course, you and the audience members already heard the arguments against impeachment, which was it's going to fire up his base, it's going to discredit the Democrats, and that the hardcore element of Trump's base likes the fact that he breaks rules and is not going to care if there's more rules that he's broken. And the reason I came down all in for impeachment is that when Trump is, again, looking for a foreign government's help to interfere in our domestic elections, that it sets up a precedent that he can not only do that, but then go even further and discredit the elections themselves. So like the first level is, let me get a foreign government to help me win our elections. It's not too much of a jump from that to say, well, the elections themselves are illegitimate or discredited because, and then imagine what excuse he could make up. Illegal immigrants are voting, undocumented people are voting, the voting machines are rigged for the Democrats are stealing the elections. And so because he's already shown a willingness to go there, it seems important that you got to stop him now. You have to strip him of legitimacy and strip him of credibility before it even gets to that level. And so I think it's actually useful to change the needle of public perception by parading on primetime TV all of the crimes that he's done and the back channel behind the scenes dealing with Ukraine that did a runaround on the State Department, and to have these, upstanding, very stoic State Department officials who dedicated their whole lives to serving the country, staring into the camera with kind of woeful and baleful and biting and bitter eyes, castigating the president and his inner team for basically trying to subvert the election. And what it does is it kind of sets up the storyline. It sets up this almost cinematic drama where you have this kind of out-of-control raging bull of a president against these kind of upstanding, do-gooder State Department officials. Now, obviously, life is a little bit more complicated, but it becomes an almost kind of televised spectacle that's easily digestible by the masses of people. And so all of a sudden they can start seeing it.
Okay, so how do you see this breaking out? Do you think the average American is going to, and we're talking more about the election here, I'm hoping the impeachment's a foregone conclusion. They're going to get him impeached in the House, probably not going to convict him in the Senate. But what do you think about the Americans at large? We started off the podcast with me talking about you having kind of a different perspective there in New York than we do here in the heartland, obviously. Well, there's a huge difference between the way people look at things in Washington, D.C. and the rest of the planet Earth, it seems like. So how do you see this playing out here as we move ahead in very short order, hopefully, towards the end of this impeachment hearing?
Well, okay, so what's interesting is that the other day I was looking at the PBS NewsHour, and there was a segment with David Brooks and Mark Shields. And so David Brooks goes around the country a lot. And what he said is that, he went to like the Midwestern states because he was on a speaking tour. And part of his job and also his personality, he's very outgoing. He likes to just have informal conversations all the time with people. So he said he probably spoke to almost like 100 people. And then, of course, he reads up on the polls. And for many people, obviously, Trump's base, all this does is confirm the very things they love about the guy. Nothing's going to change for them. But for the middle people, he said, they're not really plugged in that much. The American public has soured on politicians and institutions of government for a long time now. And what I mean by soured is that they see all politicians as corrupt, all institutions as corrupt and self-serving. And so the idea that the politician is corrupt or that there was some back channel dealing seems almost normal, and it doesn't change their perception radically of how corrupt DC is. So they're not as engaged because they already see it as kind of just part of the background, corruption that's happening. And even though people within the Beltway are just incredibly shocked at, the level of back channel dealing that Trump was doing. So there seems to be this kind of split between those who are inside the government and saying that we have rules, we have norms, we have agendas, and we're supposed to follow it because it's supposed to give us a space of neutrality and of objective professionalism that this guy betrayed. But that's how they see themselves versus the masses of people from outside the Beltway in the great expanse of the country looking at it and say, all of you guys are crooks, and this is just more comic relief. So there is that danger that it's not connecting with a lot of people. So I think probably what's going to happen is that it's not so much the fine intrigue that's going to be the selling point that finally breaks through. I think it's going to be a slow accumulation of facts that people can start digging in. Also, if it's a repeated theme, if people see over and over again, people are saying the same accusation that Trump has an awful personal character, And people can relate to character studies more than they can relate to systemic analysis. So the masses of people aren't going to look at this and say, oh, how's the system work? Did the system break down? Most people aren't really interested in institutional analysis. Most people are more able to read characters. And so when they look at Trump and they say over and over again that the State Department officials are like, this guy has a corrupt character, maybe those voters in the suburbs, mostly women who voted Republican, voted for Trump in 2016, and then voted for Democrats in 2018, that maybe that's going to solidify, because that vote was mostly about his character. They didn't like what they were seeing coming out of the White House. Now, you have to admit, whatever happens in the upcoming election, it's really most likely going to be about Trump's character and about if the Democrats can safely pitch a kind of kitchen sink program where they meet the people's needs, where the people can accept it. And if the Democrats can do those two things, that might work. Whereas, and then also build on the fact that Trump was an incredibly unpopular president for masses of people, because, again, the economy for those who are in the suburbs and voted, it actually is doing fine. The economy is, the unemployment is down, they're fine. So it wasn't a rebellion against a collapsing economy, like it says when Obama was going against McCain and the economy was going down in the 2008 Great Recession. Here the economy has a sugar high from the tax cuts. So it's really centered around Trump's character, how they perceive this guy. And I think that if the disgust continues to build in those kind of swing state, swing voters, that the impeachment process might actually help build their opinion of this guy even further. And then finally, at the climactic end, when he's impeached, that's going to send huge ripples and waves throughout the media. And now Trump is going to be stripped of a level of legitimacy and credibility. And he's going to be like an emperor who's not wearing any clothes.
Oh, God. Thanks for the visual. A giant orange man with no clothes. We'll keep that to ourselves, I guess. But, all right, so you see an opening here possibly for progressives. Now, that really interested me. You talked about that in your article. And I'm interested in an opening for progressives. This might actually give us a chance to get somebody like a Bernie Sanders in there, or a Tulsi Gabbard, perhaps. Do you see that as a potential?
The progressive thrust is building a building. It's been building now for a while. And one can make the argument that the desperate needs of working poor Americans is what propelled both Bernie to almost beat Hillary in 2016 and what propelled Trump to, remember Trump was saying, I'm going to give you the good health care, we can give you good jobs. He was appealing to a working class base. That's not the only people who voted for him, but that's who he was appealing to. And so you could say that the needs of working class, working poor, and poor Americans are what really has upended politics, for the past couple of years now. And the progressive version of that, obviously the face of that is Bernie and then Elizabeth Warren, and the other Democrats are watered down versions of it. And so they've been building, but the reality is that if Bernie or Warren was elected president, if they have a Republican Senate, that Senate is just going to kill any progressive bill, one right after the other. The Republican Senate will be a stone wall against the needed change in the country. So if Trump goes down in flames because of this impeachment, and he stands there just embarrassed, stripped of any kind of legitimacy, just like naked out there. And he's protected only by the Republican Senate. Then the Republican Senate is going to be tainted. It's going to be tied to Trump. And so if Trump goes down in 2020, he's going to take the Republican Senate down with him. Now, if that happens, that means that you will have a Democratic Senate. Now, that in itself, not a guarantee. There's lots of Democrats who are centrist. They would also stonewall anything but the most mildest reforms. So what you would need is not only a Democratic Senate, but a progressive Democratic Senate with a progressive Democratic House. They could push together, and even with that, you're only going to get at the most a moderate reform. So this is the thing. Well, when you look back at history, often what it takes is a huge social movement on the ground that involves all type of tactics. It could be an appeal. So say like the civil rights movement was a nonviolent movement, but it blocked business as usual. It sat at the counters. It marched in the streets. There was radical sit-downs. So it basically blocked business from functioning every single day until its demands were met. But it did it nonviolently. So if you had a social movement that was willing to stop the everyday cycle of business as usual until the demands of the people are met. Now, there's obviously other tactics. There's property destruction. That's a tactic, and that's been obviously done numerous times in American history and around the world. There's violent revolution, but realistically, Americans aren't going to start picking up guns because most people aren't murderers at heart, which is a healthy thing. And also, we live in the most militarized society, or not the militarized society, but we have the most powerful military in the world, so that's not going to work. So there has to be a social movement that pushes on the ground, nonviolent, that stops the cycle of everyday business from going on, so that it pushes more than just moderate reforms to a Democratic House, to a Democratic Senate, to a Democratic President's Oval Office desk to be signed by a Democrat. And then you might get some moderate to strong reforms, like some form of Medicare for all, some form of free college tuition, some form of criminal justice reform, and maternity leave for mothers and fathers. Basic, humane, decent, programs.
You talked about Bernie and a little bit about Warren there. There's another progressive in the race that supports all of those issues that you just delineated, and I'm a big fan of hers, and it's Tulsi Gabbard. Let's shift gears a little bit and just talk pure politics. The recently concluded, I think, 5th presidential debate for the Democrats just wound up. How do you feel about Tulsi Gabbard?
I haven't followed Tulsi Gabbard for the reason that I don't think she's going to be, realistically a nominee. Her numbers are incredibly far below. She's hated almost as much as Bernie, but for very different reasons by the Democratic Party elite. Yeah, they absolutely hate her. She brings up valid points about some valid points. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on her foreign policy, but her appeal in the foreign policy area is that obviously Americans are tired of these wars because they see their sons and daughters coming back with PTSD, hooked on medication. Many of them have, injuries. They've had limbs blasted off, shrapnel in their bodies. They've seen their friends die. And this war on terror has become a sausage factory for human bodies, where it's just been going on since 9/11. And to be honest, American intervention in other countries, all the way from, September 11th in the 1970s with Salvador Allende in Chile, to, kind of count all the countries in the Caribbean, the Middle East, Iraq. The U.S. has been involved in the world pretty much almost consistently as propping up reactionary and even religious fundamentalist regimes during the Cold War, the Soviet Union. Now, I know there's lots of conservatives who said, yeah, but the Soviet Union was a totalitarian society, and we needed to prop up these governments as ways of protecting freedom from the communist government. And, to some that may sound convincing, but as a man of color who sees how the United States government, in terms of mass incarceration and its shredded welfare net, has treated poor people of all races and colors in the United States, this idea of America as a beacon of freedom has always rung a little hollow to me. So this idea that, Tulsi Gabbard's foreign policy is something of interest to me is not something that I've barely followed. She's not a realistic nominee. And what did encourage me recently is when Bernie gave a speech saying that he is pro-Israel, but that the Palestinians must be treated with dignity. And, one thing I liked about Bernie is that as a Jewish American, he's never shied away from honest criticism of Israel, that obviously he's Jewish, so he's not coming from an anti-Semitic point of view. And many people who criticize Israel are not coming from an anti-Semitic point of view, but they're actually coming from an anti-colonial point of view, and they're coming at it from basically a human rights point of view, saying that Palestinians are human beings and they need to have a right to live decently, and not in an open air prison of Gaza. And so that's what Bernie Sanders is coming at it from. And so that to me was more of a beacon of light in terms of foreign policy, and also Bernie's emphasis on peace rather than war, and is much more of a beacon of light to me than anything Tulsi Gabbard has to say.
Well, Bernie's pinned his candidacy, obviously, on the domestic arena, and he's got a hell of a campaign based on that, but he's knowledgeable about foreign affairs, and I know you're a fan of his, and, I've got full confidence that Bernie can handle it, but I will say this about Tulsi. She's all knowledgeable about the world at large. She's on those important House committees. She's well-informed. She gets it, and I like her perspective. Yeah. And don't forget, she was the vice chairman of the DNC and supported Bernie, resigned when she saw the shenanigans going on there. So she's a real friend of Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders supporters. All right, well, we got to let you go. Time always slips away. We're already up against it, and want to thank you again for coming on. I told everybody at the top what a smart guy you are. Before you leave, tell us what folks should focus on now. What should they be dialing in on here as we wrap up these impeachment hearings?
Yeah, what I would tell your listeners to focus on is, hey, what is it that allows for our nation to function? And is that there are basic rules that people that are officials and politicians have to follow to ensure a certain amount of fairness. Because in a representative government with electoral politics, you have to be able to allow for different political parties to win, to succeed based on fair elections. And when you have a political party and an administration that is sabotaging fair elections because they can't win any other way, please, 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 to all of your listeners, realize that what they're really doing, it's not about Democrat, Republican. It's about fair and unfair. And it's about putting your democracy at risk. It's literally saying that we don't want to lose, even if it's fair. We would rather be corrupt and win rather than be fair and lose. And when they are subverting the democracy, they're also subverting the millions upon millions of Americans in the United States and saying that your voice doesn't matter. You don't matter. And what matters is if we can get some powerful people to put the thumb on the scale. And if you want to live in a world that has rules, that has referees and has fairness, which your voice can be heard if you organize, then you're going to have to vote against this administration, whether you're a Republican or Democrat.
No, I mean, that's well said. As always, it's not Democrat versus Republican. It's not even left versus right. What it is, it's top versus down. It's a class thing, ladies and gentlemen. Them that got it and them that don't. That's what this is all about. And if Trump wins on this, them that got it is going to get more. And they've already gotten the tax breaks. I mean, they've already got everything. They've got the most massive shift of resources the society's ever seen. They are the oligarchs, and they're going to get it all if we don't do something about it and step in and get it done now. Well, that's great.
Yeah, I know you do. So please, everyone, there's some times when you come to a turning point in history, and it's not really about what team you belong to. It's about, are you going to play the game fair or not? And this is one of those turning points, folks. It's not about being a Republican. It's about being an American. And honestly, if it was a Democrat and a Democrat was pulling this kind of trash, trying to, go to other countries to put their thumb on the scale, I would be against that Democrat too, because you can't do that. It has to be the will of the people that decides the direction of the nation, not a president in Ukraine or not the president of Russia. You can't have the elite of another country running in cooperation our country, not their damn business. All right? This country is supposed to be in our hands, not their hands.
Folks, you've been listening to Nicholas Powers, a friend of Podcast by George. We got to wrap it up here today. Nicholas Powers is a poet. He's an associate professor of literature at the State University of New York and Old Westbury, with writings in Truth Out, Huffington Post, Alternet, and The Independent, where I follow him. God, check him out. His writings are great. He's got a book of journalism entitled The Ground Below Zero, 9/11 to Burning Man, New Orleans to Darfur, Haiti to Occupy Wall Street, published back in 2014. I'll put a link on that in the information for the podcast, and I would highly recommend you reading it. And in the meantime, we'll get him back. You can hear him right here on a Podcast by George. And you can check us out everywhere podcasts are heard, basically on all of the platforms. I really appreciate people checking out Podcast by George. We've got to wrap it up, though, for right now. That's another podcast by George.